There are stories that begin with thunder, but Summer's began with a hush. On the night she was born, the world outside the windows seemed unusually still, as though even the trees held their breath. Some said the stars flickered that evening in odd little patterns, almost like a code too ancient for anyone to read. No one in the house noticed. It was a small, ordinary night to them. Yet the silence carried a weight, the kind of weight only felt when the universe itself leans in close. She was not remarkable at first glance, just a child, pink-cheeked and swaddled, learning how to breathe, how to exist. But from her earliest days there was a strangeness about her stillness. Babies often cried to announce themselves. Summer instead listened. She would gaze upward, not at faces, but at the corners of the ceiling, as though someone invisible whispered from the rafters. When the wind rattled the glass panes, she blinked with unstartled calm, as if she already knew the world had songs only the quiet could hear. Her family brushed it aside. Rick, in his absent-minded way, called her oddly observant when he noticed how her eyes tracked shadows moving along the floorboards. Morty, still clumsy with his own childhood, didn't understand her calmness and found it unsettling, but there was something about her pauses, the way she seemed to absorb the air itself, that marked the beginning of a pattern, a life shaped not by loudness, but by attention. Those who passed by her crib often felt a peculiar warmth, as though the baby herself, barely aware, held a small gravity that softened the edges of people's moods. Beth, weary from the day, would set her down and suddenly breathe a little easier. Jerry, whose nerves often tangled themselves, found himself humming softly whenever he rocked her, not realizing she was the one steadying his hands. Summer's presence was not a force but a tide, gentle, inevitable, reshaping what it touched without anyone noticing. And while the household moved on with its usual noise, Rick's muttered experiments, Morty's stumbling curiosity, Beth's sharp-edged exhaustion, Summer remained a quiet axis. No one thought to ask why her lullabies carried a faint echo that seemed to stretch longer than sound should. No one wondered why, when she stared at the night sky, stars sometimes blinked back with unusual rhythm. Her story began in that silence, in those small impossibilities, wrapped in ordinary nights. It would be years before anyone would understand that her stillness wasn't emptiness at all. It was the beginning of a listening so deep it could hear the secret murmurs of the universe. And somewhere in the hushed air, the first thread of sacrifice had already been woven, waiting patiently for the day she would notice it. As the days folded into seasons, Summer's strange stillness began to hum with something softer, something closer to song. She was still just a child, no more than a girl, learning. The shape of her own voice, yet there was a rhythm to her presence that threaded through the house. When others thought she was simply humming to herself in the corner, she was stitching lullabies from fragments of sound. Half-remembered notes, the murmur of the refrigerator, the steady drip of rain against the window. She wove them together without meaning to, her voice carrying the weight of comfort far larger than her small frame. At night, when the house finally surrendered to quiet, Summer would lie awake, listening. Not with the restless anticipation of a child waiting for morning, but with the reverence of someone who believed the dark itself had stories to tell. The hum of her lullaby drifted from her room into the hallway, soft as a thread of smoke. Sometimes Morty would pause on his way back from the bathroom, standing still, just listening. He didn't know why her song made him feel less alone, only that it did. Rick, ever the skeptic, once stopped by her door and frowned at the melody, confused that something so simple could silence the buzzing chaos in his head. He never told her that her tune made him linger. The songs never had words. They were built of quiet tones, humming in low circles, spinning around themselves the way the stars spun above the roof. Yet the family, without admitting it, began to depend on them. Beth, after long days of shouldering her own unspoken weariness, often found herself sitting at the bottom of the stairs with her eyes closed, letting summer's lullabies carry her somewhere gentler. Even Jerry, whose clumsy attempts at fatherhood often left him doubting himself, felt steadier under the invisible blanket of her voice. There was a mystery in the way her songs stretched beyond the walls. Neighbors sometimes mentioned hearing faint humming as they watered their gardens at dusk, though they never traced it back to her. Once, Morty swore he heard her melody follow him down the block, threading itself through the rhythm of his footsteps. Summer never confessed to making her lullabies travel. To her they weren't magic, they were simply necessary, the way breathing is necessary. She hummed because silence deserved company. And in these quiet songs her gift was taking root. She wasn't powerful in the way Rick's machines roared with energy, nor in the way Morty sometimes blundered into strange adventures. Hers was the quieter power, invisible to those rushing past it, but undeniable to anyone who paused long enough to feel its weight. Every note she sang seemed to teach her something about the world, that people longed to be heard even when they had no words, that stillness carried meaning, that even the smallest voice could hold the shape of belonging. As she grew into this rhythm, the lullabies began to change, shifting with her moods. On days when she felt joyful, the hum rose bright and light, like sunlight caught on water. On evenings touched by sadness she couldn't name, the melody dipped, low, steady as the tide. And though no one ever asked her where the songs came from, each family member quietly carried them like secret charms. Morty clung to them during nights when the world felt too large. Beth found in them a balm against loneliness, and even Rick, though he would never admit it aloud, sometimes adjusted his experiments so the whir of his tools matched her humming. Summer herself didn't fully understand what she was doing, only that she felt compelled to keep singing. She sensed somehow that her lullabies were more than sound. They were a way of holding threads together, weaving fragile bonds before they could break. And though she couldn't yet see it, each soft note was leading her closer to the truth of her life. That her gift, quiet and unseen, was already preparing her for the sacrifice she would one day be asked to make. Her lullabies, woven from threads of silence and shadow, carried her deeper into herself as the years passed. Each song seemed to press gently against the edges of her world, stretching outward like fingertips brushing against hidden walls. And it was during one of these hushed evenings, when the house had quieted into sleep and her voice was the only sound alive, that she began to sense something waiting above her. The ceiling seemed heavier than it should have been, as though the air itself leaned downward from the forgotten attic. She had never been inside it. No one in the family cared for it. It was simply a place where dust gathered and objects slumbered in boxes, sealed by time. Yet Summer's lullabies reached toward it, as if the old wood listened, as if something behind the locked door remembered the tune. She became restless with curiosity, though hers was not the kind that burned hot. It was slower, patient, a curiosity that grew like moss, steady and quiet. Nights of humming turned into nights of pausing mid-song, her eyes lifting toward the ceiling. She thought she heard faint vibrations, like an echo of her lullaby replayed on some hidden instrument above her head. No one else noticed. Morty was already fast asleep in his room, and Beth and Jerry were lost in their private routines. Only Rick seemed to linger sometimes, his gaze flicking up, as if he too felt the attic's strange gravity. But he said nothing, leaving Summer to wander alone. The night she finally climbed up was not dramatic. There was no thunder, no flicker of lightning, only the steady creak of the ladder and the soft hush of her own breathing as she pulled herself into the dark. Dust swirled around her in the thin shaft of moonlight, and the air was thick with the scent of old wood and forgotten fabric. At first it looked like nothing, just boxes stacked unevenly, old trunks, scattered tools. But her humming, quiet and instinctive, seemed to stir something among the relics. One of the boxes rattled faintly, not in menace, but as if it had been waiting to be found. She crouched before it, brushing away the thin blanket of dust. The cardboard was brittle, the tape yellowed. Inside, beneath layers of cloth and paper, were objects that hummed faintly when her fingers brushed them. A cracked mirror with a frame etched in strange spirals, a broken compass whose needle twitched toward her instead of north, and a book missing its cover, filled with pages where words had faded to faint smudges. None of it made sense. Yet each piece seemed to breathe against her palms as though they recognized her voice. Summer sat there in the moonlit attic, the relics surrounding her like quiet witnesses. She began to hum again, softer this time, almost a whisper. To her surprise, the cracked mirror quivered faintly, its surface rippling as though the song had passed through it. The compass needle spun once and then stilled, pointing not outward, but upward, toward her face. The book's faded pages trembled as though they longed to be read aloud even in their broken state. She didn't know what these things meant, but she felt no fear. Instead, she felt recognition. As if her lullabies, which had always seemed to bloom out of nowhere, had finally found their roots. When she descended from the attic that night, she carried nothing in her hands, only the weight of a new certainty in her chest. The objects would remain where they were for now, but the thread of connection had been woven. Her voice, her strange gift, was not an accident of childhood. It was an inheritance, waiting quietly for her to grow into it. And though she did not yet know what it asked of her, she sensed that the songs she sang were no longer just for comfort. They were keys, and somewhere in the dark, a door was waiting to be unlocked. In the days that followed her quiet discovery in the attic, Summer carried herself with an awareness she couldn't quite name. The objects she had left behind, mirror, compass, book, seemed to trail after her in memory, echoing faintly in her thoughts like a hum that never ended. She didn't speak of them, not to Morty, not to Rick, not even to herself out loud. Yet when she closed her eyes at night, she felt their presence hovering close, listening to the rhythm of her lullabies the way she once thought only walls and shadows did. It was as though she had unlocked a window she could not close again. Her humming grew stronger, without her willing it to. The notes, still soft and fragile, began to do more than soothe. They shifted the air. One evening, while Beth sat downstairs with her head heavy in her hands after another long day, Summer's voice floated from above. Beth's exhaustion seemed to dissolve, as if the weight she carried had been lifted into the rafters. She never asked why, never questioned the change, but she began lingering in that same chair more often, waiting without admitting it. Morty, too, found that the strange, nervous energy that followed him into sleep would ease the moment her voice rose through the thin wall between their rooms. He didn't want to confess that her songs were keeping his fears at bay, but he noticed how much darker the nights felt when she was silent. Summer herself only half understood. The first time she truly noticed was on a night when the wind battered the windows, rattling the glass so hard she thought the house might split apart. She curled beneath her blanket, frightened in a way she rarely allowed herself to feel, and began to hum, not to calm anyone else, but simply to still her own trembling heart. As the tune stretched into the storm, the rattling softened, the howling wind dulled into a low breath, as if the night had decided to listen instead of rage. She pressed her face into the pillow, continuing until she felt certain the house was safe. By morning, the storm was gone, and the garden outside lay untouched, though the neighbors spoke of broken fences and fallen trees up and down the street. She kept this quiet, unsure if it had been chance or something else, but the memory lingered. The attic relics had shifted something within her. The mirror that rippled, the compass that turned toward her, the book that trembled. They had been signs, and her songs were no longer just harmless hums. They carried weight. They bent the air around her. And though she still clung to the simplicity of childhood, some part of her was beginning to understand that her gift demanded more than comfort. It demanded choice. Rick was the first to sense the change, though he said nothing directly. One night, as he tinkered with a device cluttered with wires and humming sparks, her voice drifted down from upstairs. The lights above his workbench steadied, their flicker smoothing into a calm pulse. His hand froze mid-solder, eyes narrowing. He muttered something under his breath, words no one would ever hear, and turned the dial on his machine as if to test it. The device's unstable hum smoothed itself into the same rhythm as her lullaby. He stared at it, then at the ceiling, frowning not in disapproval, but in recognition. He would never admit it, not yet. Still, for a moment, his lips curved faintly, the closest he came to a smile. Summer felt none of this. To her, the songs were simply flowing faster now, like rivers widening with age. They answered her without asking permission, carried her forward whether she wished to follow or not. And though she still hummed for comfort, for her family, for herself, the truth lingered in the silence after the notes faded. Each lullaby was no longer just sound. It was power, quiet and waiting, a power that could not remain hidden forever. Jerry was the one who noticed her gift in the gentlest way, not by design, not by study, but by accident. He was never a man of sharp perception, yet perhaps that made him the only one who could feel her presence without trying to measure it. His clumsy kindness, the way his hands always fumbled yet somehow landed where they were most needed, made him open to the kind of subtle truths others overlooked. One evening, when the rest of the house was tangled in its usual noise, Rick in his lab, Beth lost in tired sighs, Morty slouched in restless daydreams. Jerry sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at unpaid bills. His shoulders sagged as though every page carried the weight of years of not being enough. Summer, passing by in her quiet way, paused at the doorway. She did not speak. She only hummed. The sound was soft, almost unnoticeable, like a thread pulled loose from the fabric of silence. Jerry blinked, then exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath until it left him. He didn't look at her, not at first, but the edge in his face softened, the way ice gives way beneath sunlight. When at last he turned, his eyes met hers, and though neither spoke, something in that glance told him she saw the weight he carried without needing words. He tried to laugh it off, stumbling into an excuse about bad math and tired eyes, but the sound faltered. Instead, he asked her if she'd like to sit with him. She did. That became their rhythm. Jerry, awkward and earnest, fumbling with half-broken projects or small chores, and Summer, steady and watchful, humming her wordless songs as though stitching together the frayed edges of his confidence. She never offered advice. She was still too young to know the shape of advice, but her presence gave him courage to stumble less. He began to attempt things he would otherwise abandon, folding laundry with more patience, daring to cook without Rick's mockery pressing in. Sometimes he read old magazines aloud to her, stumbling through articles with exaggerated voices while she hummed low beneath his words. It was not guidance in the traditional sense. It was companionship, the kind that wraps itself around failure and makes it less frightening. In these moments, Summer began to understand that her gift was not only for calming storms or steadying machines, it was for people, their fragile, quivering hearts that longed for someone to notice them without judgment. Jerry, of all people, became her mirror. His clumsiness reflected her own uncertainty. His persistence taught her the shape of endurance. And in return, she gave him something he didn't realize he needed, the comfort of being enough, even when the world measured him as less. There were nights when Jerry lingered in the living room, listening to her hum as she drifted toward sleep upstairs. He never told anyone, but sometimes her voice steadied him more than Rick's inventions or Beth's reassurances ever could. He began to treasure her presence, though he never wrapped it in dramatic words. Instead, he carried his gratitude in the small way he made sure her favorite mug was always clean, or the way he sat a little straighter when she entered the room. His care was clumsy, yes, but it was real. And Summer, still too young to name it, felt the warmth of being believed in. Through Jerry, she realized that her songs did not only pass through the air. They settled into people, left traces like faint lanterns glowing inside their chests. And though she could not yet see the full path ahead, she sensed that her bond with him was not an accident, but a lesson, that even the quietest gifts mattered most when offered to the ones who doubted themselves. In the silence that followed her lullabies, she began to hear it clearly, the truth that her power was not only about what she gave, but about what it awakened in others. If Jerry had shown her what it meant to steady another person through kindness, then Morty revealed to her the quiet ache of being misunderstood. Their bond was never loud or obvious. Morty, fumbling through his own tangle of insecurities, often kept his distance, as though unsure how to stand in the same room as her stillness. Where Summer hummed to soothe, Morty spoke to fill the air, tripping over half-formed ideas, desperate to be heard. Yet, even in his chatter, there were moments when his voice cracked in ways he couldn't hide, and Summer caught those fractures the way a net catches falling leaves. She never interrupted, never told him he was wrong. She simply listened, her silence holding him steadier than words could. There were evenings when he lingered outside her door, pretending to be on his way to the bathroom or searching for something he had dropped. She always knew. He would stand there, awkward and restless, until her humming drifted through the crack beneath the door. His body would shift, shoulders dropping, breath slowing, the unease that clung to him loosening just enough for him to walk away calmer than before. He never admitted that he waited for those moments. She never pointed it out. The bond was wordless, stitched together from pauses and hums, and the comfort of being known without explanation. Sometimes he tried to mirror her gift in his own way. He would sit beside her with a notebook, scribbling clumsy shapes and symbols, as though trying to translate her songs into something he could hold. The lines never made sense, not to him, not to anyone, but Summer would glance at the page and smile. Morty took that as enough. In her smile, he felt less like a burden, more like someone who could be seen. He didn't need her to say she believed in him. Her humming told him so more clearly than words ever could. There was one night, late and heavy with shadows, when Morty stumbled into her room after a nightmare he couldn't shake. His face was pale, his words broken. Summer didn't ask him to explain, she only shifted on her bed, making space for him to sit. He curled beside her like a frightened child, though he was too old to admit it. She hummed then, low and steady, the notes filling the air until his shaking slowed. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen, letting the sound fold around him. He didn't understand how her voice worked, why it felt like safety when the world outside was so vast and cruel. But in that moment, he didn't need to understand. He only needed to rest. From then on, their silence together became its own kind of language. Morty still stumbled, still doubted himself, but he carried her songs with him like small anchors, invisible yet unyielding. Summer, in turn, learned from his presence that her gift was not about perfection. It was about offering what one could, even when clumsy, even when misunderstood. She began to see that her songs were not only for easing others, but for binding hearts that might otherwise drift apart. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both felt it. An invisible thread stretched between them, fragile yet firm, humming with a rhythm only they could hear. A thread that would hold even in the face of storms yet to come. The bond with Morty lingered in Summer like a steady pulse, and perhaps it was because of this closeness that her gift deepened, as though the thread between them had widened a door she hadn't known existed. At first, it came quietly, slipping into her awareness during the half-lit hours of night. She would lie awake, humming faintly to herself, when sudden flashes of color bloomed behind her eyelids, soft blues, muted greens, streaks of gold. They weren't dreams of her own, but she felt them brush against her mind as if drifting from rooms nearby. She did not know how she understood this, only that the colors carried weight, each one breathing with the rhythm of someone else's sleep. The first time she recognized Morty's dreams, it startled her. His restlessness painted itself in jagged bursts of red and grey, clashing and unsettled. She didn't see shapes or hear words, just the raw tone of what he carried. Instinctively she began to hum, low and careful, and the harsh red slowly softened, the grey lightening into silver threads. She didn't need to peek into his room to know his breathing had steadied. She felt it, his body loosening as the storm of color gave way to calm. She stopped humming then, not out of fear, but out of awe, realizing her songs had slipped into places she had never meant them to go. As nights passed, she learned to notice the differences. Beth's dreams floated like faint violet currents, weary, yet strong, though sometimes tinged with sharp lines of black that pulsed with quiet sorrow. Jerry's drifted in muddled shades of brown and yellow, fragile and confused, but brightened with patches of soft orange whenever he dreamed of being enough. Rick's, when she dared to reach toward them, were the hardest to hold. His sleep was a fractured storm of silver and green sparks, flashing so violently that her humming often broke against them. Yet even there, she sensed how her notes lingered faintly in the cracks, softening edges that no one else could touch. She never told anyone. To speak of it would have made it smaller, more fragile. Instead, she kept it secret, carrying the knowledge like a lantern cupped in her hands. Each night she listened. Each night she learned. Dreams were not only private landscapes, they were languages of color, shifting truths that revealed what waking hearts refused to admit. And her lullabies, once simple comfort, had become responses. She was no longer just soothing the air around her. She was entering the quietest places of those she loved and leaving a piece of her gentleness there. Yet with this gift came unease. The colors did not always soften under her humming. Some resisted, stubborn and sharp. Once she brushed against a dream not her own, a presence outside her family, drifting on the edge of her awareness. It was vast and colorless, a hollow white that seemed to stretch endlessly. She recoiled, breaking her song mid-note, and for the first time felt the cold weight of something listening back. The memory haunted her, not with terror, but with a warning. Her gift was growing, and with it came doors she was not yet ready to open. Still she returned to it night after night. For Morty, whose fractured reds needed softening, for Beth, whose violets carried the exhaustion of unspoken fears, for Jerry, whose muddled yellows longed to be steadied, even for Rick, whose storms of light seemed to demand a presence that would not break. She hummed, she listened, she gave what she could. And though no one knew, the colors taught her something she could never have learned in daylight, that love was not only spoken, not only shown, but dreamed, hidden in shades and shadows, waiting for someone to notice. Her secret knowledge of dreams carried into the waking world, changing the way she moved through her days. Summer began to notice the faintest traces of color even in daylight, as though pieces of the night followed her into morning. When Jerry stumbled over his words at the breakfast table, she saw a flicker of pale yellow tremble behind his eyes. When Beth lingered too long at the sink, silent and still, there was that violet hue again, dim and aching. Even Morty, restless and distracted, carried faint streaks of red that never fully left him. The colors were everywhere now, overlapping like translucent veils, and though no one else seemed to notice, Summer felt them settle into her like a quiet truth she could not put aside. It was in the backyard that her gift first rooted itself into something visible. The garden had never been much, patches of earth where weeds fought with tired grass, a place largely forgotten except when Rick needed space to test his machines. But one afternoon, when the sky was heavy with clouds and Morty had stormed off after another small humiliation, Summer wandered into the yard, humming under her breath. She crouched by the soil, pressing her fingers into the dirt, and let the tune flow through her chest as though she were speaking directly into the earth itself. At first, nothing changed. Then, slowly, tiny stems bent toward her voice, trembling as if listening. She kept humming, softer, steadier, and before her eyes, the dull, green leaves began to shimmer faintly, glowing with a light too soft to be mistaken for sunlight. She gasped, but didn't stop. The glow spread from leaf to leaf, a fragile luminescence like stars caught in veins of green. By the time she lifted her hands from the soil, the patch of weeds had transformed into something stranger, something beautiful. Plants that pulsed with a faint radiance, responding to the rhythm of her song. Summer sat back on her heels, staring, her heart racing. This was no trick of imagination. Her lullabies had slipped into the living world, coaxing it to reveal something hidden. She visited the garden often after that. At night, when the family thought she was asleep, she would slip outside and hum among the glowing plants. They answered her faithfully, swaying even when there was no wind, their light rising and falling with her breath. It was not just beauty, it was companionship. She felt the garden listening, holding her secrets, reflecting back the colors she carried from others' dreams. Each plant seemed tied to a memory. One glowed faint red when Morty's restlessness grew too loud, another dimmed to violet when Beth's exhaustion deepened, and sometimes faint silver sparks glimmered in the leaves when Rick's storming mind brushed too close. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where her songs could exist without restraint. She understood now that her gift was not only for people but for the world itself, woven into soil and root, leaf and light. And though she felt awe, she also felt the same unease she had sensed when that colorless dream pressed against her. The glowing plants were proof that her lullabies carried power beyond comfort, beyond what she intended. Power always asked something in return, though she did not yet know what it would demand. One evening, as she sat among the glowing leaves, Morty appeared at the back door. He froze, wide-eyed at the sight of the faintly shining garden. Summer looked up, humming still, her eyes meeting his. For a moment he didn't speak. He only watched, caught between fear and wonder, as though unsure if this was magic or simply Summer being herself. Finally, he stepped closer, whispering her name as if the garden might vanish if he spoke too loud. She didn't explain, and he didn't ask. They stood together in silence, bathed in the glow, bound by a secret neither was ready to share. And as the stars overhead blinked faintly in their strange, coded rhythm, Summer realized her gift was no longer something she could keep hidden forever. It was spreading roots into places she could not control, and with every note she sang, the world seemed to lean in closer, listening, waiting. The garden's glow became part of her nights, a secret light only she and Morty shared, but secrets have a way of drawing things toward them. It was on one of those evenings when the plants shimmered faintly and the air was heavy with the smell of damp soil that she noticed someone beyond the fence. At first, she thought it was a shadow cast by the tall trees, but the shape lingered too long, still and listening. She did not stop humming. The notes carried out into the dark, and the figure stepped forward, not threatening, but deliberate, as if her voice had called them there. The man looked weathered, his clothes plain and worn, his eyes deep in a way that made her think of wells too old to measure. He said nothing at first, only stood near the edge of the garden, watching the faint light ripple across the leaves. Summer felt no fear, only the same curiosity that had drawn her into the attic years ago. She stopped humming, and in the silence his voice emerged, low and rough, yet strangely careful, as though he hadn't spoken in a long while. He told her that songs which bend the world are never accidents, that voices like hers appear only when the world begins to hunger for them. His words were plain, but carried a weight she felt more than understood. She wanted to ask him who he was, how he knew what she could do, why he had come. But her mouth stayed still, her questions curling inward. He seemed to know the questions anyway. He leaned closer to the glowing plants, brushing one gently with the back of his hand. The leaf brightened beneath his touch, pulsing as though recognizing him. He looked at her then, eyes soft but unyielding, and told her she must learn that gifts are never free. They tie themselves to choices, and choices always cost something. Before she could speak, he stepped back. The shadows swallowed him easily, as though he had never been there at all. Summer stood frozen, her pulse loud in her ears, the garden swaying faintly as if it had overheard a truth it could not forget. Morty, who had been watching from the doorway, rushed to her side, asking who the man was, what he had said. She shook her head, not because she didn't know, but because she could not put the weight of his words into language Morty would understand. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her lullabies caught in her throat. The traveller's voice echoed through her mind, repeating that warning. Gifts bind, gifts cost. She thought of Jerry's softened shoulders, Beth's eased exhaustion, Morty's quiet trust, even Rick's storms briefly calmed by her songs. She had given them comfort without asking anything in return. But what if the gift itself was already demanding something she had not noticed yet? The unease returned, like the colourless dream she once brushed against, and for the first time the silence of her room felt heavier than her humming could soothe. By morning, the unease hadn't left her, but the garden still glowed when she looked out the window, faithful and waiting. The traveller was gone, yet his presence remained like a stone dropped into a well, ripples spreading unseen. She didn't know when she would see him again, only that she would. And when she did, his words would not be a warning anymore. They would be a door. The traveller's words lingered inside her, a quiet echo that colored every note she hummed. She no longer sang without thought. Each melody seemed to press against the question of what it might cost, what it might be shaping, in ways she could not yet see. The garden continued to glow faithfully, but now its light felt different, like a reminder rather than a comfort. When she touched the leaves, she noticed how they bent toward her hand, not just passively, but as though reaching, as if her voice had taught them to adapt, to move in response to her. It unsettled her, though it also fascinated her. The garden was no longer just alive, it was listening. The change spread beyond the plants. One afternoon, Morty tripped on the porch steps, scraping his knee. He hissed and tried to laugh it off, embarrassed, but the pain showed on his face. Summer knelt beside him and, without thinking, placed her hand lightly near the wound. She hummed in a low circle of sound, steady and calm. Morty's breathing slowed, his shoulders relaxed, and when he finally looked down, the sting seemed dulled, the raw edge of hurt softened. The scrape was still there, but the pain had retreated, tucked away by her song. Morty stared at her, wide-eyed, before muttering thanks he didn't fully understand. She only nodded, though inside she felt the truth stir again. Her gift was not only to comfort, it was bending things, reshaping them. Even Rick noticed. He caught her one evening when she thought herself alone, standing in the kitchen as she hummed to a cracked glass on the counter. The fracture line shivered, trembling like a string pulled too tight, then stilled, no longer spreading. Rick's eyes narrowed, his lips twitching into something between suspicion and recognition. He didn't interrupt, didn't mock, but later she found one of his tools left on her desk, a device she couldn't name, silent and inert, as if waiting for her to test it. He had given no explanation, only a silent challenge, a way of saying, "I see you." The weight of the traveller's warning grew heavier with each new thread of power. Summer began to feel her songs stretch, adapting to whatever they touched. Soil, skin, glass, even the faint storms of memory inside her family. Each time she gave, something shifted in return, like tides pulling both shore and sea. She wondered if this was what he meant by cost, not a price paid all at once, but a slow weaving, her voice tying itself into the world until she could no longer separate where she ended and where everything else began. One night, sitting in the glowing garden, she whispered her lullaby into the air without any intent at all, just to hear her own voice steady her. The plants swayed, the colors of her family's dreams brushed faintly against her, and for a fleeting second she felt her own edges blur. It was as if she could stretch, her awareness bending outward, reaching into places she couldn't name. The sensation frightened her enough to stop. She pressed her hands against the earth, grounding herself, listening to her heartbeat until it slowed. But she knew what she had felt. Her empathy wasn't only a song anymore, it was something living, pliant, capable of reaching further than she ever imagined. She lay awake after that night, unable to hum, afraid of what her voice might touch if she did. Yet beneath her fear there was also a pull, undeniable and patient. The gift was growing, bending her into shapes she had not chosen, and though she longed for stillness, she sensed that stillness would never belong to her again. Summer began to notice that her mother's silences were louder than her words. Beth carried herself like someone who had practiced composure so long that it had hardened into armor. But Summer could feel the weight beneath it. The colors she had learned to see made Beth impossible to ignore. Deep, violet tones pressed into her shoulders, streaks of black threading through her breath. It wasn't anger, not entirely. It was weariness, the kind that settles when too many choices have been made without ever feeling like the right one. One evening, after another long day in a house humming with Rick's inventions and Morty's clumsy struggles, Summer found Beth alone at the kitchen table. Her mother's hand rested against an untouched cup of tea, her gaze fixed somewhere far away. Summer sat across from her without a word. The silence stretched, not sharp, but heavy, like a curtain neither of them knew how to lift. Summer hummed then, barely audible, almost uncertain. Beth's eyes flickered, the tension in her jaw loosening as if a knot had been tugged free. Beth smiled faintly, though it was the kind of smile that tries to hide what it cannot heal. "You always hum," she said softly, almost to herself. "Even when you were little. I used to think it meant you were nervous." Summer tilted her head but kept humming, the sound circling gently through the room. Beth shook her head, letting out a quiet laugh that sounded more like a sigh. "But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you hum because you're steady when the rest of us aren't." Her voice cracked then, just enough for Summer to hear what lay beneath. Summer wanted to speak, to ask what her mother carried, why her violet tones always felt so close to breaking. But words didn't come. Instead, she reached out, placing her hand lightly over Beth's. The hum deepened, threading between them, and in that shared stillness Beth closed her eyes. For the first time in longer than Summer could remember, her mother allowed herself to lean, if only for a moment. The colors shifted slowly, violet softening into a gentler hue, the streaks of black dissolving like smoke. Summer felt it happen beneath her fingertips, felt her song slipping into the cracks of Beth's silence and filling them with something that wasn't exactly peace, but was close enough to breathe in. Beth exhaled, long and shaky, and when she opened her eyes, she looked at her daughter, not with curiosity, but with recognition. She didn't ask how. She didn't need to. That night, after Beth went to bed, Summer lingered alone in the kitchen. The traveler's warning returned to her, sharp as ever. Gifts tie themselves to choices. And she realized then that her mother, strong and unyielding in the daylight, might need her more than anyone else. It was not a duty she had asked for, yet the bond was undeniable. Each song she gave cost her something she could not name, but she could no more withhold it than she could stop breathing. As the house settled into sleep, she sat by the darkened window, humming faintly to herself. She thought of her mother's smile, fragile but real, and of how her voice had reached a place words never could. And for the first time, she wondered if her gift was not simply about calming others, but about teaching them to rest in their own hidden truths. The calm she had offered her mother stayed with Summer, but it was not a simple calm. It was layered like the surface of still water, hiding currents beneath. Beth's eyes that night had told her something unspoken, that a piece of the burden had shifted, not vanished, and that her voice had carried it for her. Summer lay awake afterward, sensing that her gift was not only a comfort, but a vessel, taking in what others could not hold for themselves. She wondered how much she could carry, and whether there would come a day when the weight she gathered might be greater than the strength she possessed. The nights began to feel heavier. When she hummed now, the air seemed to press back harder, her songs pulling at her chest, as though each note was stitched from something deeper than breath. Morty still lingered by her door, Jerry still softened in her presence, Beth still leaned quietly into the space she made, but Summer began to feel the faintest tremor in herself afterward, as if her songs had cost her a little more than before. She never spoke of it. To do so would make it real. Instead, she continued, steady and quiet, as though her silence might keep the truth at bay. One evening, while the family moved restlessly through the house, she sat alone in the glowing garden. The light in the leaves pulsed faintly, out of rhythm, like a heartbeat faltering. She hummed to steady them, but the glow resisted, flickering stubbornly. For the first time, her song did not soothe. The plants seemed to wither at the edges, their radiance leaking into the soil as though drawn away from her. A chill threaded through her body. It was not that the gift had failed, but that it had asked something she could not give without leaving herself thinner than before. She thought of the traveller then, his eyes like old wells, his warning echoing, "Gifts bind, gifts cost." She understood now that his words had not been about danger from outside, but about the erosion within. The power she carried was not infinite. Each act of comfort, each thread of calm, was also a thread pulled from her own being. She was stretching, bending, weaving herself into others, and though it brought them ease, she felt the hollowness it left behind. When she returned inside that night, Rick caught her in the hallway. He didn't ask what she was doing. He didn't need to. His gaze lingered on her longer than usual, sharp and searching, and for a moment she thought he might say something, but he only grunted, turning back toward his lab. Even he, with all his words and cleverness, seemed to know that what she was facing had no explanation worth giving aloud. Summer closed her door, sat on the edge of her bed, and hummed faintly to herself. The sound was steady, but her chest ached as if every note was carved from something essential. She pressed her palms against her knees, breathing carefully, and realized that her path would not allow her to remain only a daughter, only a sister, only a girl humming lullabies in the dark. The gift was shaping her into something else, something that would one day require her to choose how much of herself she was willing to surrender. And though the house lay quiet around her, Summer felt the shift as clearly as she felt her own heartbeat. The beginning of sacrifice had already begun, and it was moving closer with every song she sang. The ache she carried from that night did not fade. If anything, it deepened, stretching into her days the way a shadow lengthens as the sun sinks low. Summer still hummed because she could not stop, but she began to notice that her lullabies no longer belonged to the small, safe spaces of her family alone. They seemed to slip through walls, carried further than her intention, brushing against ears she did not know. More than once she caught neighbors pausing at the fence, their faces softened as though they had stumbled into a memory. Once, passing strangers on the sidewalk stopped mid-conversation, turning their heads toward her window as if drawn by something they could not name. It unsettled her, yet she felt powerless to contain it. The melody had grown beyond her, shaping itself as though it had its own will. What frightened her most was not that others could hear it, but that they responded as if the song reached into their quiet places, just as it did with her family. People lingered longer, their steps slowing, their gazes unfocused. They looked both calmed and emptied, as though some piece of their burden had been lifted into the air. Summer sensed it each time, the way her voice took something from them and held it, weaving it into her own chest. She sang less afterward, her throat sore though she had not raised her volume, her body heavy with a weariness she could not explain. One evening, while she sat in the glowing garden, a woman she had never seen before stopped at the edge of the yard. She did not speak, did not move closer. She only stood with her hands clasped tightly, eyes glistening, listening to Summer's soft, steady hum. When the song ended, the woman bowed her head, whispered a thank you so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind, and walked away. Summer's hands trembled. She hadn't meant for her song to touch someone she did not know, yet it had slipped out of her control. That night she lay awake, the traveller's warning echoing louder than ever. Gifts tie themselves to choices. She had not chosen to sing for strangers, yet the song had chosen for her. It frightened her, but buried within the fear was something else, an understanding she wished she could ignore. If her voice was spreading outward, reaching beyond her family, then the day would come when it reached too far, when it would bind her to a choice she could not take back. Rick's sharp gaze seemed to linger on her more often after that, as though he could sense the shift. He never asked, but she noticed how his experiments grew quieter when she hummed, how his machines pulsed in rhythm to her notes without his instruction. Morty, too, seemed more restless, watching her with the unease of someone who felt change but could not name it. Even Beth and Jerry, though softened by her presence, began to look at her with something unspoken in their eyes, as if they felt the weight of what she carried but could not bring themselves to ask what it was. Summer continued because she knew nothing else. But she carried the knowledge now like a stone in her chest. Her lullaby was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the world, and with every note she sang, she stepped closer to the sacrifice that waited for her, patient and inevitable. The sky that day had a strange stillness to it, the kind that pressed gently on the chest, not heavy enough to hurt, but enough to make you pause. Summer felt it the moment she stepped into the garden. The plants still glowed faintly, though their light had taken on a dimmer tone, like candle flames flickering low in their final stretch of wax. She didn't hum. Not yet. Something in the air was already humming for her, a vibration just beneath hearing, like the quiet before a storm that doesn't arrive. She stood for a long time, eyes closed, waiting without knowing what for. And then she felt him. The traveller didn't speak as he stepped from the edge of the yard. He moved like someone who belonged to every shadow he'd ever passed through, present but barely held by the world. Summer turned to face him. Her heart didn't race. It beat slow and sure, like it already knew this moment had been waiting. "You've been using it," he said, not as a question, but as a truth. His voice was the same, dry, quiet, not unkind. She nodded. "It's not mine anymore." The traveller tilted his head, watching her the way one watches the tide come in. "It never was," he said. "You've just been holding it long enough to forget that." Summer didn't argue. The garden pulsed gently behind her, and her throat ached faintly from nights of too many songs. She looked at him and asked, finally, "Why me?" His gaze held hers for a long time before he answered. "Because you listened. Most people don't. They hear, but they don't listen. Not to dreams, not to silence, not to grief." She swallowed hard. "But I didn't choose this." "No," he said, "but you're the one singing." That was when he stepped closer. The air around him seemed to bend inward, like the world held its breath. He extended a hand, not in offering, but in question. "You're not just singing for them anymore. You've started singing for places that don't ask nicely. There are wounds older than your family, older than this town. There are places where the world forgot how to heal. And your voice is starting to reach them." She didn't speak. She couldn't. A part of her had known this was coming ever since the first stranger lingered at the fence, since the dream with no colour, since her mother's silence softened in her hand. "What are you willing to give?" the traveller asked. The question was quiet, but it settled into her chest like a stone dropped into a still lake. She didn't answer. Not yet. But she looked at her palms, at the garden behind her, at the house where Morty's quiet dreams curled into soft red, where Jerry's hope was still learning to stay upright, where Beth's sadness drifted in steady waves. She looked at the sky, at the trees, at the way everything held its breath for her. She was no longer a girl with a lullaby. She was a thread now, woven through her family, her garden, her town. A part of her wanted to run. Another part wanted to ask for more time. But both of those parts were quieted by the deeper knowing inside her. The gift had never been about what she could do. It was about who she would be when the world finally asked too much. And now the world was asking. She didn't sleep that night. The house lay quiet, the walls breathing with the rhythms of those she loved, but Summer remained still, sitting at the edge of her bed with her arms folded around her knees. The traveler's question kept threading itself through her thoughts, not pressing, not demanding, just existing, patient and unrelenting. What are you willing to give? She thought of her mother's silences, softened by her songs, of Morty's restless dreams settling into softer reds, of Jerry, who smiled a little more easily now, and Rick, who still refused to name what he saw in her, but whose machines no longer fought the hums that drifted from her room. She thought of the strangers who had begun to pause and listen, and the aching light of her garden, now flickering like a memory already half faded. Something had begun to break beyond the horizon of her awareness. It was subtle, like the sound of something deep cracking beneath ice. She had felt it earlier in the day before the traveler appeared. Just a sharp, cold note vibrating through the air. That didn't belong. Now, in the dark, it returned. Not with noise, but with absence. A hollow pressure, like part of the world had gone silent in the wrong way. She stood without knowing why and walked quietly through the house, barefoot, careful not to wake anyone. Outside, the wind had stopped. Not calmed, stopped. The trees were still, the stars too bright. The glow of her garden had dulled to the faintest pulse, and beyond the fence the air shimmered faintly like heat, though the night was cool. Something was pressing in, and it did not knock. It had no shape, no face, but Summer felt it the way one feels the moment before being touched in the dark. Her breath caught. It was not rage or malice, it was need, endless, aching need. She stepped into the garden, her feet brushing against the dimly glowing leaves. The earth beneath her felt brittle, like the ground was holding itself together out of habit, not strength. The pressure grew heavier, not louder, just closer, and somewhere inside her, the song stirred. Not the usual hum she carried gently like a thread, but something older, deeper, rooted in the same quiet place that had first drawn her to the attic, to the dreams, to the voice of the traveler. Her voice trembled as it left her throat, the first note uncertain. The air resisted. Her second breath was steadier, and the third note pushed through. The shimmer in the distance recoiled slightly. The silence snapped like glass hit by a stone. She kept singing, barely above a whisper, and the world around her began to shift, not violently, but like something folding inward, reconsidering. This was not a song to comfort, it was a song to contain. She felt the effort pull from her like warmth from her fingers in winter. The air grew cold, the stars dimmer, and still she sang. Her knees weakened, her pulse slowed, her voice cracked, but she held the melody. It wasn't beauty, it was scaffolding, something invisible holding the shape of the night in place. The pressure began to ease, slowly, hesitantly. Whatever had pressed forward retreated, not defeated but held, not cured but calmed for now. When the last note left her lips, the wind returned with a whisper, brushing her hair, as if to say thank you, or we'll be back. The shimmer was gone. The trees resumed their gentle rustle. The garden sighed. Summer fell to her knees, not because she was afraid, but because the effort had taken something she wasn't sure she could replace. She closed her eyes and let the earth cradle her. The lullaby still pulsed in the air around her, invisible threads woven tightly across a gap that no one else could see. The world hadn't broken, not yet. But something had shifted. And the next time it came, it wouldn't be patient. She stayed in the garden until morning, curled beneath the faintly glowing leaves, her breath shallow, her limbs heavy. When the sky began to pale and the world resumed its usual rhythm, the distant hum of traffic, the birds testing their voices, the house creaking as it stirred awake, Summer rose slowly, her bones feeling older than they should. The lullaby had done its work. Whatever had come pressing against the edges of the world had been kept at bay. But she knew now that this wasn't the end of it. It was a beginning wrapped in silence. She moved through the next days quietly. Her voice returned gradually, her hums softer than before, as though they needed time to grow back. The family noticed her tiredness, but no one asked. Morty looked at her longer, as if waiting for a reason to say something, but always turned away at the last moment. Rick's glances sharpened. Beth lingered a little too long by her bedroom door. Jerry brought her tea without explanation. They all felt something, but no one could name it. And then the dreams changed. She first noticed it in Jerry. One night, as her own sleep drifted toward that familiar edge where the dreams of others began to shimmer, she saw something strange. Jerry standing in a field that did not exist, surrounded by glowing plants. They pulsed with her rhythm. In the dream, he was not himself. He stood straighter, calmer, as though her presence lived inside him. And then he turned, and there she was, not watching, present, standing beside him in the field. Dream Summer looked at her, not confused but aware. She woke with a start, her breath caught, heart fluttering like a bird behind her ribs. It wasn't unusual for her to feel the shape of others' dreams, but to see herself inside them, not as an observer but as a figure they dreamed of, was something new. It didn't stop with Jerry. Morty's dreams came next, fractured and red as always, but now threaded with flickers of green light, like leaves glowing behind his eyes. She caught glimpses of her silhouette, blurred and distant, always just out of reach, as if he remembered her not from waking, but from something deeper. Then Beth's dreams, flooded with violet and dim starlight, began to shift. Summer saw her own hand holding Beth's, not in comfort, but in guidance. Each time she returned from the dreams, she woke with her chest tight, her hands curled. The dreams were echoing back. Even strangers began to hum in their sleep. She passed them on the street, faces she didn't know, and felt it in the air around them. A faint residue, a familiar tune left behind like dew. One morning at the grocery store, a child began to hum her melody absent-mindedly while walking beside his mother. The tune was imperfect, halting, but unmistakably hers. Summer froze. Her gift had outgrown her again. The lullaby, once a private thread she sang in shadows, was now echoing through the dreaming minds of those she had never touched directly. Her presence had bled into their sleep, not through her intent, but through the shape of what she had become. She stood in front of her mirror that night and stared at herself. Same hair, same tired eyes, but behind them something else. A flicker of light that didn't come from the lamp. A faint pulsing, like the garden still hummed inside her. She placed a hand on the glass, uncertain whether she was seeing her reflection or someone else's memory of her. The dreams weren't just responding to her anymore, they were remembering her, carrying her. And if the dreams could carry her, she wondered, what else might begin to call her back? She hadn't meant to end up in Rick's lab, Her feet had wandered there on their own, the way a river finds its bend without needing to be told. The door was slightly ajar, the glow from within a pale green, the hum of machines quieter than usual, as if even they were waiting. She hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether to turn back, but then he spoke. "Been waiting?" he said, without looking up. His hands were buried deep in the open heart of some unfinished machine, wires spilling like veins across the workbench. "Figured you'd show up after the dream started echoing." She stepped inside, slow. "You saw them too?" Rick chuckled, but it wasn't mocking. "You think I don't monitor brainwave residuals? Morty's head's basically a leaky faucet for dream activity, and you—" He finally looked up. His eyes, sharp and weathered, held something unfamiliar. Not pity, not pride, something older. "You're leaking into people's REM cycles like a melody stuck in the teeth of the world." She didn't smile. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "I know," he said. "Doesn't matter." He gestured to the mess of tools. "Things grow. You don't always get to say where they root." For a moment, the room buzzed with quiet. Summer moved closer, standing beside the machine, her hands at her sides. "You knew," she said. Not a question, just truth pressed into sound. "I suspected," he admitted. "Didn't know the shape of it until you started echoing." Her voice was quiet. "What is it, Rick? What am I becoming?" Rick didn't answer right away. He reached across the table, picked up a small device, a memory projector, and turned it over in his hands. "There are harmonics in the universe," he said finally. "Frequencies that don't belong to physics as we understand it. They show up in places where reality's thin, where grief collects, where time forgets itself. Most people ignore them. Some go mad trying to hear them." He looked at her. "You sing them." The words settled on her skin like snow. "You're not just calming people, Summer," he continued, softer now. "You're anchoring something, stitching things back together when they start to fray. That's not empathy, that's—" He stopped, frowned, then whispered, as if to himself, "Why, that's function." She didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Her gift, it seemed, was not an accident. It was a response, a system, a mechanism that had chosen her voice as its vessel. Rick leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "You're not the first, but you might be the last one we get before something gives out." Summer blinked. "What does that mean?" He looked at her for a long time, and for once there was no sarcasm behind his eyes, only exhaustion. "It means," he said, "the world's been splitting at the seams for a long time. Most people don't notice until it breaks. You noticed before it did, which means—" He tapped his temple. "Now you carry the needle." Her chest tightened. The lullabies, the dreams, the echoes, they weren't just comforts. They were repairs. She took a step back, the weight of it all rising like tidewater behind her ribs. Rick watched her, then added gently, "You don't have to like it. You just have to keep singing." She left the lab in silence, her feet unsteady, the world around her suddenly brighter and heavier all at once. The hallway lights flickered slightly as she passed. Behind her, Rick turned back to his machine and muttered into the silence, "Don't burn out, kid." That night, her sleep felt different even before it began. The air in her room was too still, the quiet too deep, as if the house itself had paused to let something else arrive. Summer lay on her back, eyes open to the dark, waiting. Not out of fear, but recognition. Whatever was coming, she had already invited it by asking questions she couldn't take back. When the dream began, it didn't start with her. She wasn't herself, not at first. She was floating above a landscape that pulsed with a rhythm she didn't understand, stitched together from fog and memory. It was like walking into a room built from someone else's breath. The ground below shimmered, neither solid nor sky, and in the distance there was a sound, not quite music, not quite voice, a single long note, stretched like a beam of light through time. It was being sung, but not by her. She followed it. The note guided her across shifting terrain, fields that flickered in and out of color, trees that grew in slow reverse, stars that hovered too close. As she moved, the note grew clearer. It was a lullaby, but not any melody she had ever sung. It carried the same weight, the same purpose, but its pattern was older, its language unfamiliar. Still her chest ached with recognition, as if the song had once lived inside her before she was ever born. The voice was waiting. She found it at the edge of a still lake, beneath a sky filled with constellations that didn't exist. A figure stood in the water, waist-deep, draped in light that moved like breath, not quite human, not quite spirit, just presence. The song flowed from them, steady and low, and Summer realized this wasn't a dream she was having, this was a memory, and it wasn't hers. The figure turned, and for a moment Summer saw eyes that mirrored her own. Not identical, but familiar in that quiet, aching way you recognize someone who carries your shape, even if the face is different. The figure raised a hand, not in greeting, but in offering. "Your thread is not the first," they said, and their voice was layered, like many voices overlapping in perfect harmony. "We sang to hold the first cracks, before you, before the dreaming learned your name." Summer stepped closer to the water's edge. "Why me?" she whispered again. The figure tilted its head. "Because you listen, because you stay when others close their eyes." The lake rippled, and in its reflection she saw herself, young but older than she felt now, alone yet not afraid, a thread pulled tight between past and present, and beneath it all the lullaby continued, sung in that ancient voice, not hers, not yet. "You will give more than you think," the figure said, and now their voice was growing fainter. "And it will matter more than you'll ever know." Summer opened her mouth to speak, to ask, to hold on. But the dream folded inward, like a paper note being closed in careful hands. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a melody in her mouth she didn't know how to sing. The melody followed her into waking like breath into lungs. It didn't fade as most dreams do. It clung, delicate and precise, waiting beneath the surface of her thoughts. Summer sat on the edge of her bed in the early light, hands resting against her thighs, as the first line rose again in her throat, wordless but full of shape. She didn't hum it, not yet, not until she was sure it would still be there. It was. Outside, the house began to stir, Beth running water, Morty shuffling sleepily in the hallway, Rick coughing faintly through the metallic clank of his tools. Life moved as usual, unaware of the new thread coiled quietly in her chest. She made her way to the garden, bare feet pressing into dew-wet grass, and stood among the plants that had once lit up in rhythm with her voice. Now they lay dim. Not lifeless, just dormant, as if they too were waiting for something new. She closed her eyes and let the unfamiliar melody rise from the memory not her own. At first, the sound wavered, like a baby bird testing its wings. It didn't resemble her usual lullaby. This one turned in unfamiliar intervals, dipped into silences she wouldn't have dared to leave empty before. But she trusted it. The song wasn't asking for permission. It had already chosen her. The garden responded first. Leaves tilted toward her, then pulsed faintly with a light she hadn't seen before, silver, with a green core, like a soft star just beginning to warm. The soil beneath her feet hummed, and far off, beyond the fence, beyond the houses, dogs stopped barking, cars slowed. Somewhere, someone paused mid-sentence and forgot what they were saying. The world was listening. Her voice didn't strain, it didn't ache. Instead, it expanded as though the melody itself was carrying her. She was no longer humming to soothe or contain. This was invitation, a call to something that had been hiding behind the veil of dream and memory, waiting for a voice that could carry it forward. When she stopped, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt whole, held. The garden glowed quietly, not in her rhythm but in its own. A response. She turned to find Rick watching from the porch, a mug in his hand, his gaze sharp but unreadable. He didn't move, didn't speak, just nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if confirming something he had suspected for a long time. Then he turned back inside. Summer stood alone again, but the loneliness didn't press as hard as before. The melody lived now, and not just in her. It had seeded itself into the world. And whatever came next, she would not face it with silence. The town seemed ordinary at first light, ordinary in the way that only hides the fragile lines beneath the surface. Summer walked through the quiet streets, the garden's melody still pulsing faintly inside her chest, and noticed subtle anomalies she hadn't before. A lamp post trembled, its light flickering not with electricity but with a slow, uneven rhythm like a heartbeat struggling against a cage. The pavement along the main street had begun to fissure, fine cracks weaving in patterns too deliberate to be random, and the air carried a faint hum, almost imperceptible, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She paused at the edge of the town square, taking in the scene. No one else seemed to notice, or perhaps no one could. A car passed without honking, the driver distracted by something invisible, and a child's bicycle wheel wobbled against the curb, leaving faint tracks that shimmered slightly before vanishing. The cracks weren't spreading violently, but they were spreading slow and deliberate, a quiet erosion of the ordinary that could have gone unnoticed if she weren't listening. Summer knew immediately what it meant. The lullabies, the dreams, the garden, the echoes she had begun to leave in the world. They had stretched farther than she had realized. Her voice had tethered the town, held the fabric together. Without it, the fissures would have widened, threads of chaos threading through the streets, through the buildings, through the people she had unknowingly touched. She knelt on the pavement, pressing her hands gently against the cracks. She didn't hum at first. Instead, she breathed, letting the rhythm of her chest sync with the pulse of the fissures. Then, slowly, softly, she began to sing. The melody was tentative, woven from all the harmonics she had learned, her lullabies, the echo of dreams, the unfamiliar note from her memory, not her own. It began to flow outward in subtle waves, brushing against each crack, brushing against the tremble of every lamppost, every cobblestone, every heartbeat she had unwittingly touched. The cracks shivered, then softened. The lampposts' flicker steadied. Even the air seemed to align, the faint hum fading into gentle rhythm. Summer's voice grew, steadier, richer, stronger, not because it demanded power, but because it had found its purpose. She was not controlling the world, but sustaining it. Her song was the scaffold, holding fragile places together before they collapsed. Minutes passed. The town's ordinary pulse returned, almost imperceptibly different, smoother, lighter. Summer exhaled, trembling slightly, aware of the effort it had taken. Each note had pulled from her in a way she felt deep in her chest, a soft hollow that left her lighter, yet wary. She rose slowly, hands brushing against the air, as though feeling the threads she had tied invisible and tight across the streets. Behind her, the first faint shimmer of dawn began to touch the horizon, and the town continued to awaken, unaware of the quiet catastrophe that had been prevented by the voice of one small girl with a gift larger than she had ever known. The weight settled into her like an invisible mantle. Summer felt it first in her chest, a pressing warmth that spread to her throat, to her hands, to her feet, until even standing still required effort. Her gift, once gentle and quiet, was no longer a soft pulse. It had grown into a tethered force, pulling her outward, even as it demanded inward attention. Each note she sang now left a small echo behind in her own body, subtle but persistent, a strain she could feel in the hollow spaces beneath her ribs. She walked through the garden at night, the leaves glowing faintly beneath her careful steps. She had hummed earlier, yes, but the strain had left a residue, a weight that even the soft pulse of the plants couldn't absorb. Her hands trembled when they hovered over the soil, and she pressed her palms flat, letting herself lean into the earth as though it could take some of the burden. The glow brightened in response, slow and hesitant, pulsing like a heartbeat that matched her own. She thought of Morty, asleep in the house, his dreams still threaded with the flickers of her voice. She thought of Beth, resting her head against the pillow, and Jerry, still clumsy in his gentleness, all of them tethered to her melodies whether they realized it or not. And she knew, as she had known in the quietest corner of her mind, that every act of singing carried cost. The strain was cumulative, layering beneath her skin, threading into her heartbeat, tugging at the edges of her stamina, her focus, her very being. She pressed her face into the soil of the garden, inhaling the faint scent of dew and glowing leaves, and let the melody rise from her throat. This time it was not to soothe, not to anchor the town, not even to bend dreams. This time it was to sustain herself, to remind herself that even as she gave, she had to remain present in her own body. Each note shivered through her limbs, vibrating into every nerve, every tendon, and yet she held it steady. Minutes passed, she hummed, until the faint tremor in her chest softened, until the glow of the garden pulsed with a rhythm Haki could ride rather than resist. Sweat dampened her hair, her knees weak beneath her, but the world remained whole. The cracks in the town, the fissures in sleep, the tremors she had begun to feel, all were held, suspended by the force of her voice. She rose, hands slick with dew, and looked up at the stars. The sky had shifted slightly. Constellations that had once seemed fixed now felt like currents in a stream. Somewhere beyond her garden, beyond the streets, beyond the sleeping minds she had touched, there was a pulse that carried her song further than she could see. And though her body ached and her chest bore the subtle hollowness of repeated effort, she understood what the traveler had hinted at long ago. Each act of giving, each thread she tied into the world, exacted a toll. Yet even in the strain, she felt the faint stirrings of awe, of quiet power, of something larger than herself that had chosen her to hold it together. The song lingered in the air long after she stopped, humming between the leaves, carrying the residue of effort, the echo of responsibility, and the shimmer of possibility. The choice came quietly, without ceremony, on a night when the wind had shifted and the stars hung low, hesitant in the sky. Summer walked the streets barefoot, letting the cool pavement press into her soles, listening for the faint tremor in the world that only she could hear. The fissures had begun to show again, subtle cracks in the streets and sidewalks, tiny disturbances in the dreams she had begun to see as extensions of herself. The town was calm on the surface, unaware, and she felt the weight of knowing that calm depended on her attention. She paused at the corner of the square where the first lamp-post had trembled weeks before. Its light flickered, faint and unsteady. She knelt beside it, hands hovering above the base, and felt the subtle pull, an insistence that was not violent, but relentless. The choice lay before her. She could sing, draw from herself to mend the fracture again, knowing it would hollow her further, or she could step back, let the world bear its own weight, and risk what she could not predict. Her chest ached with the memory of every song, every night spent holding unseen cracks at bay. She felt the strain in her limbs, the fatigue threading through her veins, yet in the garden of her mind she saw the familiar pulsing glow of what she had built, Morty's dreams steadying, Beth's exhaustion softened, Jerry's hope flickering stronger than before. The town, fragile but alive, waited for her. Summer closed her eyes and let the melody rise slowly, testing the air. The note quivered, carrying not only sound but the weight of intention. It reached into the cracks, brushing gently against the fissures, coaxing them closed. The lamppost steadied, the pavement tremor eased, and somewhere beyond the square, the hum of the sleeping mind softened, weaving the town into a quiet equilibrium once more. When she finally stopped, she sank to her knees, trembling. Her body bore the subtle hollow of effort, the cost of tethering something larger than herself, but the world remained intact. She had chosen to give again, knowingly, willingly, with full understanding of the strain it brought. The power she carried was not benign, not light, but it was hers to wield for those she loved. She sat there long after the cracks had ceased, letting the city breathe beneath her, letting herself gather the echoes of her own song. The moon had shifted and the stars were higher now, faintly trembling, as if acknowledging the act. Somewhere deep within her, Summer understood that this was the shape of her gift, a quiet, unrelenting responsibility that demanded courage not in battle, but in care, in persistence, in the willingness to endure so others might rest. The night arrived silently, heavier than the usual calm, as if the world had paused in anticipation. Summer sat in the glowing garden, legs crossed, hands resting on her knees, the faint pulse of the plants around her echoing the slow rhythm of her heartbeat. She hummed softly, the note low and steady, threading into the soil, brushing against the edges of the fissures she had felt in the town. Somewhere beyond the fence, in the shadows between streetlights, movement stirred. She sensed it before she saw it, a presence that leaned into her song, waiting for acknowledgement. From the corner of the yard, the traveller emerged again, stepping lightly as if he belonged more to the night than the ground beneath his feet. His eyes were the same deep, unfathomable wells, holding knowledge that both comforted and unsettled her. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he let the quiet stretch between them, letting her hear not only the garden, but the subtle tremor in her own chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, unhurried, almost melodic itself. You've held the fractures, you've sung them closed, but it is not enough to preserve. There will come a time when you must choose what to carry and what to let break. Summer swallowed, the words pressing into her, heavy with implication. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I've been careful. I've given everything I can." He shook his head, stepping closer to the edge of her garden's glow. "Careful is not enough. Giving everything you know is only the beginning. The threads you tie now will demand more than your body or your voice can hold. The world will ask for more. You will be tested beyond the nights you've already endured." Her chest tightened, the garden's pulse seeming to echo the tension within her. She realized that every lullaby, every song woven into the dreams of others, every crack held in check, had been a rehearsal, a preparation. And yet, she was not ready, not entirely, to comprehend the weight of what awaited. "You mean the cost?" she asked, voice trembling. The traveler's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "Yes, and not just cost to yourself, to those you care for, to the threads you've tied. Some things cannot be untied, Summer. Some acts of care demand their own echoes, and they will reach into places you have never imagined. You are not only singing for this town anymore. You are singing for something far larger, something older, and it will answer in ways you cannot predict." She closed her eyes, letting the words sink into her chest, into the marrow of her bones. The night pressed close, the faint hum of the plants growing stronger, responding to the tension she carried. Her throat ached with unspoken understanding. She could not flee. She could not stop. Her song had already spread further than she had ever realized, and now the traveler had named it, the broader scope of her gift, the inevitability of its demand. When she opened her eyes again, he was gone, leaving only the faint shimmer of air and the glow of the garden as witnesses to his warning. Summer knelt there, silent, the weight of the coming choice settling over her like a tide. She hummed again, softly, not to hold back fissures, not to calm dreams, but simply to remind herself that she was still here, still able to give, and still learning what it meant to hold the world in her voice. The strain settled into Summer gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. She noticed it in the mornings, waking with a tightness in her chest that made her inhale slowly, deliberately, as if drawing breath itself was a tethered act. Her limbs ached faintly, a low hum of fatigue, threading through muscle and bone. She tried to ignore it at first, telling herself it was nothing, just growing pains or the remnants of restless nights spent tending the garden and her family's dreams. But the awareness persisted, settling heavier with each passing day. Even her voice began to feel different. The lullabies that once slipped effortlessly from her throat now pressed against her, each note a small exertion that left a hollow behind. Singing to calm Morty, to steady Beth, to soften Jerry, to hold the fissures of the town in place, all of it exacted a toll she could feel in the pull of her shoulders, the subtle trembling of her hands, the faint ache that threaded behind her eyes. And yet she sang anyway, because she could not stop, because to stop meant letting everything unravel. The garden had become her anchor. She spent hours among the glowing leaves, pressing her palms against the soil, leaning into the earth as if it could shoulder the weight she carried. The light pulsed in response, steady and patient, giving her a rhythm to follow even as her body protested. Each night she hummed longer, the melody stretching across the fences, the streets, the sleeping minds she had touched. Sometimes passing strangers paused in their walk, unknowing witnesses to the invisible threads she tied across the world. Morty noticed her fatigue more than anyone else. He lingered in doorways, watching her, carefully, unsure if he could speak without breaking the fragile balance of her concentration. Beth and Jerry began to notice too, in the subtle droop of her shoulders, the hollow catch of breath that she never admitted to anyone. Rick, silent as always, watched from the shadows of his lab, the glint in his eyes betraying recognition of the cost she bore. He said nothing, but she felt it, an acknowledgement that what she carried was heavy, more than anyone could see, more than words could measure. And still, the pressure mounted. Summer felt the strain in the quiet moments between songs, in the silence after the echoes of her melody faded. Nights became longer, darker, stretching into the edges of dreams she could no longer fully enter without exhaustion pressing against her bones. Her voice faltered sometimes, breaking in the middle of a note, yet she steadied it because she knew that faltering might let the world slip a little further into instability. Each act of care left her lighter in one sense but emptier in another, a paradox she began to understand as part of her path. The traveler's warning returned in her mind, sharper now. Gifts bind, gifts cost. She had felt the cost in her body, in the hollow left behind in her chest, in the quiet pulse of the town she held together with invisible threads. And she knew, deep down, that what lay ahead would ask for more than she had yet given. Yet the choice remained hers. To sing, to endure, to give beyond what seemed reasonable, or to step back and let the world bear what she had so far held in her voice. Summer pressed her hands against the earth, drew in a breath that trembled with both fear and resolve, and hummed again, letting the sound flow into every crack, every dream, every pulse of the town. The strain was real, the cost was tangible, but she was still here. And as the faint glow of her garden pulsed beneath her fingertips, she understood. Sacrifice was not a single act, but a rhythm she would follow for as long as she could. The first signs were subtle. At the edges of her awareness, Summer began to notice ripples in places she had never touched, patterns that echoed her songs but carried nuances she could not trace. A neighbor's porch light flickered in rhythm with a note she had hummed the previous night. A child walking past her home hummed an unfamiliar echo of her melody, small and tentative, yet unmistakably hers. Even the wind seemed to carry fragments of her lullabies through the streets, brushing windows, rustling leaves, leaving impressions that whispered of her presence. Summer felt the weight of it immediately. The gift that had been intimate, that had lived quietly in the spaces of her family and garden, had begun to spread beyond the borders she could see. She pressed her palms against the cool earth of the glowing garden, drawing herself into the pulse of the soil, trying to contain the ripples, but they stretched like water into distant channels, reaching corners she could not measure. The strain was sharp, unlike anything she had felt before, muscles taut, chest hollowed, her voice quivering before she had even sung. She realized with a quiet awe that carried a tinge of dread that the echoes had a life of their own. The melodies she had once controlled now carried traces of her intent, yes, but also traces of themselves, mutations in the night, faint and unpredictable. A lullaby hummed, for Morty might drift into strangers' dreams, and a song meant for Beth might ripple into unknown households, small flickers of calm and tension intertwined. The world was learning her rhythm before she fully understood it. Summer closed her eyes, letting the cool night air brush her face. She breathed in slowly, drawing the weight into herself, letting the echoes settle around her shoulders like a shroud she could both bear and sense. Her song rose quietly from her lips, a single note at first, careful, controlled, weaving through the cracks in the town, through the unconscious minds, through the subtle fissures in the waking world. It was not loud, it did not need to be, it only needed to exist, to anchor what was fraying, to remind everything that some measure of care persisted. The echoes responded almost immediately, lights steadied, shadows softened, air that had trembled with subtle dissonance aligned into a faint, steady hum. And yet, for all the order she had brought, she felt the cost like a soft pull at the center of her chest, a hollowness that had no shape, no name, but left her muscles slack and her limbs heavy. She hummed again, weaving the fragile threads, sustaining, bending, holding, until the garden's glow pulsed back into harmony and the town seemed at rest. Summer knew then that the gift was no longer simply hers to wield. It had begun to reach beyond her choice, beyond her family, beyond her intent. The world listened, and in listening, it demanded more. And somewhere, deep in the quiet between notes, she felt the first premonition of the true sacrifice, the moment when giving no longer meant merely helping, but giving in full, letting herself be the bridge for forces she could barely understand. The strain had begun to press deeper than she had anticipated. Summer felt it in her thoughts first, subtle tremors that slowed her thinking, whispered fragments of memories that weren't quite hers, and a faint buzzing at the edge of perception that pulsed in rhythm with her own heartbeat. The gift that had once been a song now seemed to ripple into the spaces between thought and action, demanding her attention not only in melody, but in mind and spirit. She found herself drawn to the garden before dawn, when the air was thick with dew, and the first light softened the edges of the world. The plants pulsed gently, waiting for her, and she knelt among them, pressing her palms into the damp soil. Her voice rose from deep in her chest, trembling at first, then steadying, weaving through the earth, the leaves, and the faint fissures she had begun to sense in the town beyond. Each note carried a weight she could feel in her bones, a soft ache that throbbed with the effort of keeping invisible cracks from widening. The echoes reached farther than before. Windows rattled faintly in houses she had never entered. Dreams twisted and shifted, carrying fragments of her song into minds she did not know. Even the streetlights along the main avenue shimmered with a rhythm that matched her pulse. Summer could feel the thread stretching across the town, pulling gently at the fabric of the world, delicate yet insistent, and she realized with quiet awe that her lullabies had become a latticework of containment and care. Her chest ached and her knees trembled as the effort pressed on her. She pressed her palms harder into the soil, letting the song flow through her and into the earth. The garden's glow brightened in response, leaves bending toward her touch, pulsing with a light that seemed almost sentient. She had begun to understand that the gift required endurance beyond the act of singing. It required her presence, her awareness, her very being. She thought of Morty, of Beth, of Jerry, of the unseen neighbors and strangers touched unknowingly by her song. The cost was not only in her body, but in the tethering of her mind and heart, the subtle hollowing that followed every act of care. Yet even as the strain pressed deeper, she knew she could not stop. The fissures would spread if she did, and the echoes of what she had already woven would unravel without her voice to guide them. Summer exhaled, letting the song taper gently, holding the last note against the pulse of the earth. The garden's glow dimmed slightly, settling into a steady rhythm as if acknowledging her effort. She rose slowly, aware of the hollowness in her chest, the tremor in her limbs, but also of a quiet resolve. The world was fragile, yes, and her gift was costly, but she was still able to hold it, to carry it, to give it. And in that fragile balance between exhaustion and purpose, she understood something deeper. The true sacrifice had begun, and it was not a single act, but a lifetime of choosing to sing, even when the weight pressed against every part of her. The strain had begun to stretch beyond familiar boundaries. Summer sensed it in the nights that followed, in the subtle vibrations that hummed through her bedroom floor, through the walls, into spaces she had never visited. Her gift was no longer confined to the town she walked through or the dreams of those she loved. It reached outward, brushing against minds she would never meet, brushing against fears she could not name. She felt them in fragments, a shadow of anxiety in a distant child's sleep, a faint tremor of loneliness in a voice she had never heard, a pulse of grief lingering in a place she could not see. She stood in the garden again, hands pressed into the damp earth, trying to weave the thread she had learned to control. The glow of the plants pulsed faintly, but her voice strained against the weight of what she now carried. Each note reached farther than she intended, bending space subtly, shaping the air itself. She felt hollowed from the inside, the ache threading through her chest and limbs, yet she continued, because to stop meant letting fissures grow unchecked, letting the echoes unravel. The world seemed to listen in ways she had not anticipated. A distant street lamp flickered with a rhythm matching her pulse. Somewhere far beyond the garden, a window trembled, as though the building itself leaned in to catch her song. Her humming shifted, adapting to each subtle disturbance, bending to the needs of minds she could not name. She realized with awe and apprehension that her lullaby had become a scaffold, fragile but indispensable, carrying weight far beyond the reach of her understanding. Fatigue pressed on her relentlessly, threading into her limbs, clouding her vision, pulling at her awareness. Her voice faltered, but the garden pulsed in response, steadying the rhythm. Summer pressed her palms harder against the soil, feeling the pulse of the town, the hidden hearts, the unseen echoes, and let the strain settle into her. She hummed again, longer this time, shaping the invisible currents, holding the fractures, weaving them into a fragile harmony. As the night deepened, she felt the cost most acutely, not in the garden, not in the town, but within herself. Her chest ached, her knees trembled, and yet she continued, knowing that each act of giving would demand a piece of her being, that each note carried a toll she could not anticipate, that each echo she stitched into the world drew a thread from herself that could not be returned. When the last note left her throat, the garden dimmed slightly, settling into a steady glow. The town slept peacefully, the fissures held, the echoes calmed, and yet she remained, hollowed and weary, aware that this was only the beginning. The gift had grown beyond her body, beyond her family, beyond the place she knew, and its reach would not relent. She pressed her hands into the soil one last time that night, closing her eyes against the ache, breathing slowly, and accepted the truth. Her voice had become a bridge, a burden, and a responsibility, stretching into places she had never imagined. The cost was real, the strain undeniable, but she would continue, because to stop was unthinkable, and to give was the only way to hold the fragile world together. Summer sat in the quiet of her room, the glow of the garden fading behind the curtains, the hum of the night settling into something gentle and watchful. She pressed her palms together, feeling the faint ache that had become familiar, a reminder of every note sung, every dream steadied, every fissure held in place. Her eyes traced the ceiling, but the lines and shadows seemed to pulse faintly, like echoes of the world she had woven with her voice. The responsibility pressed not only on her body, but into the hollowed spaces of her mind, whispering that every act of care left its mark. She thought of Morty, sleeping lightly in the next room, the faint threads of red and green still pulsing softly in her awareness. She thought of Beth, of Jerry, of Rick, of the strangers whose dreams and fears had brushed against her song without her ever knowing it. Every face carried a trace, and she felt it like a tide pulling at her ribs. She realized that the gift she bore was more than melodies. It was legacy. Each act of singing, each choice to give, had stitched her presence into the quiet fabric of those she touched. She carried them in her voice, and they carried her in turn, whether they knew it or not. The ache deepened, threading through her shoulders and into her chest, a steady reminder of the cost she bore. Her throat felt hollow after each note, but she hummed quietly to herself, letting the melody flow just enough to remind the world and herself that she was still present, still willing to give. It was not for reward, not for recognition, but because the world, fragile and unseen in its hidden currents, had begun to lean on her voice without asking, and she could not turn away. Summer's mind wandered over all the places her gift had touched, imagining the lives it had brushed, the comfort it had sown. She pictured the quiet relief in someone's chest, the pause in breath that let them find sleep, the subtle calming in towns and streets that no one would ever name or measure. She understood then that her song had become invisible scaffolding, a lattice of care that would outlast her own knowledge of it, echoing in ways she could not trace. A wave of fatigue washed over her, pressing her to the floor as if the effort of holding all that weight had finally found a body to rest upon. Still she hummed softly, almost inaudibly, letting the tone vibrate through her hands into the floor, into the garden, into the unseen spaces she had woven into the town. She felt her presence echo through those spaces, not in her sight, but in her awareness, a tether connecting herself to the lives she held. She realized then that legacy was not something given at the end, but something lived in the present, threaded through moments, actions, and choices. Her gift, her cost, her song, they were all part of it. Every act of care carried weight, and every note sung left its mark, a delicate imprint that would persist beyond her own awareness. Summer closed her eyes and let herself rest for a moment, allowing the resonance of all she had done to settle around her. The ache was there, faint and persistent, but she understood it not as burden alone, but as proof of the lives she had touched, the world she had held, the quiet but lasting echo of her voice. The nights had begun to weigh differently on Summer, heavier and more insistent, as if the world was slowly pressing its need into her bones. She moved through them carefully, stepping outside into the garden, bare feet brushing the dew-laden grass, aware of the faint pulse of light in the plants beneath her hands. Each glow mirrored her own exhaustion, each shimmer a reminder that the act of giving was no longer a gentle hum, but a persistent tug at her spirit. She hummed softly, feeling the strain ripple through her chest, her arms, her legs, and even into her thoughts, where the faint ache threaded between memories, worries, and dreams. The fissures in the town that had once been subtle now vibrated faintly at the edges of her perception. Sidewalk cracks, trembling lampposts, subtle disruptions in the rhythm of sleep among strangers. These were not emergencies, not yet, but she felt the pressure as clearly as she felt her heartbeat. Her voice rose slowly, tentative at first, then steadier, carrying through the streets, threading into the cracks, the gaps, the restless currents that had begun to stretch beyond her control. Each note was a measured effort, a negotiation with the weight pressing back against her from all directions, a silent promise that she would continue holding what the world could not hold on its own. Her body ached, her knees trembled, and yet she could not stop. The gift had begun to claim her in ways that were both subtle and insistent, even as her song soothed, even as the town's quiet fissures seemed to stabilize. She felt threads of herself stretching, thin, invisible strands tied to everything she had touched and everything yet beyond her reach. Morty's dreams pulsed faintly with her melody. Beth's exhaustion softened into fragile starlight. Jerry's hope steadied like a delicate filament, but the strain in her chest whispered a warning. There was more to come, and the next call of the song would demand not only her voice, but her very being. The traveller's words returned, haunting in their clarity. Gifts bind, gifts cost. Summer understood now that the gift had never been a gentle companion, but a weight that asked for her surrender, piece by piece, note by note. And she realized with a quiet determination, pressing her palms into the glowing soil, that she would continue to give, knowing the cost would only deepen with each act. She hummed through the night, the melody threading into the fissures, into the town, into the dreams she could not see, carrying the weight, shaping the world, holding the fragile fabric together. And though exhaustion trembled at the edge of her senses, she stood unwavering, aware that this was only the beginning. Each note was a commitment, each echo a tether, each moment a step toward a sacrifice that was greater than she had ever imagined, but necessary, inevitable, and hers to bear. The strain became unmistakable. Summer felt it in her bones first, a dull ache that pulsed in time with the invisible threads she carried. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the glowing soil, the garden no longer just a sanctuary, but a conduit, humming faintly with the echoes of the town, the dreams, the fissures that stretched beyond her sight. Each note she sang now pulled not only from her voice, but from the very core of her presence, threading into minds, into air, into spaces she could not perceive. The effects reached farther than she had ever imagined. In the early hours of the night, distant places began to respond. Streetlights flickered across neighborhoods she had never walked through. Sleepers murmured half-formed words she didn't recognize, echoes of her melodies bending into their subconscious. Somewhere, far beyond the town, a faint pulse stirred in a city she had never visited, as if her song had extended a fragile hand into the unknown, touching lives she had no right to influence, and yet could not resist. Her chest ached, her legs felt leaden, but she continued, letting the song flow, not for comfort, not for control, but because the world itself had begun to lean on her voice. Each note exacted its toll, leaving a hollow ache that spread beneath her ribs and threaded into her mind. The strain was now unmistakable. Her gift was no longer gentle or optional. It demanded presence, endurance, awareness, and sacrifice in ways she had only glimpsed before. Summer felt the weight of responsibility settle across her shoulders like a tangible thing. The echoes had begun to carry fragments of her own being into places she could not see, shaping lives, calming fissures, holding invisible structures in place. She realized then that the cost of giving was not only the exhaustion pressing into her body, but the gradual extension of herself into the world, her presence, her voice, her essence, stretching thin across distances she could not measure. The garden pulsed faintly beneath her hands, a steady rhythm that reminded her of her purpose, but also of the gravity of the path she had chosen. To stop was impossible. To falter was to risk the unseen fractures widening, to let the delicate balance she had held slip into chaos. And yet, the strain in her chest whispered a warning. This was only the beginning. The true demand of her gift had yet to fully reveal itself, and when it did, it would not wait for her to prepare. Summer exhaled a long, shivering breath and let her voice flow once more, steady, unwavering, a tether against the world's quiet unraveling. She hummed through the ache, through the hollowing, through the weight pressing down, and understood at last that her lullaby was no longer a song. It was a responsibility, a bridge, a quiet, unrelenting act of care that would define the shape of everything she touched and demand from her more than she had yet imagined. The morning light spilled softly across the garden, brushing the glowing leaves with a quiet warmth. Summer rose slowly, feeling the residue of nights spent threading her voice through the fissures of the world, carrying the weight of unseen lives. Her body ached, and yet in the ache there was clarity. She had given, and in giving, she had learned the true measure of her gift, not in moments of triumph, not in the quiet glow of plants, but in the persistence of care, in the steady pulse of attention stretched across countless unseen corners. She walked among the garden's luminescent leaves, pressing her palms against their pulsing surfaces, feeling the echo of every note she had sung. Each glow, each trembling filament of light held a fragment of the world she had helped steady. Morty's dreams, Beth's exhaustion, Jerry's tentative hope, even the distant echoes in strangers' slumber, all threaded together in a quiet tapestry that she alone had tended. The knowledge weighed her down, yet it also lifted her. She understood more fully than ever that her presence mattered in ways the world could not name, and that her song had become a living thing, stretching beyond intention, beyond control, beyond expectation. Summer paused, letting herself sit among the foliage, eyes tracing the patterns of light and shadow. The strain she had carried, the hollow ache in her chest, the trembling in her limbs, the subtle erosion of her rest, was still there, but she embraced it as part of the legacy she had woven. It was not weakness, but proof of persistence, not punishment, but witness to the scope of what she had been entrusted with. She thought of the traveler, of Rick, of every night she had hummed to calm the fissures, to hold the unseen currents together, and of every choice that had stretched her beyond herself. And she realized, legacy is not a final monument or a single act. It is the accumulation of care, persistence, and attention of a voice raised in hope, even when the weight is nearly unbearable. Summer closed her eyes and hummed softly, letting the garden carry her song outward, into the town, into dreams, into places she would never see. The light pulsed in harmony with her breath, steady, patient, persistent. She felt herself in the song and the song in herself, a quiet, unbroken loop that bound her to the world she had held together, and that would continue long after any one night, any one act, any single note. The garden dimmed slightly as the morning brightened, but the rhythm remained, a living echo of care and presence. Summer rose, feeling the ache, feeling the quiet hum, and understood finally that giving was not a moment, but a lifetime, not an act, but a way of being. And somewhere beyond the visible, beyond what she could perceive, the world had been steadied, stitched together by the resonance of her presence. She stepped back from the garden, a deep, tremulous breath filling her lungs, and whispered into the morning. Her gift, her voice, her care, they were enough.